In the autumn of 1874, a family of 9 walked into a hollow in the Blue Ridge Mountains of western North Carolina, built a cabin beside an old stone well, and were never seen alive again. Their name was Bellamy. When neighbors finally climbed the ridge in the spring, what they found in that cabin was so wrong, so far outside anything they had words for, that the county sheriff burned the building to the ground before sundown and forbade anyone to speak of it. The well was capped with iron. The land was salted. The children in the valley below were told the hollow was full of copperheads and to never ever go near it. But 3 men who saw the inside of that cabin left written accounts. One was the sheriff, one was a Methodist circuit rider who was called up the ridge to pray, and one was a doctor from Asheville who came to certify the deaths and left his medical bag behind because he could not bring himself to touch it again. Their accounts agree on one thing: the Bellamy family did not die of hunger. They did not die of cold. They did not die of any sickness the doctor could name. They died because they drank from that well, and whatever came out of that well drank them back. Before we go one step further into that hollow, I want to hear from you. Drop a single word in the comments right now. Just one word. Tell me what you think was really in that well. Was it something the Bellamys brought with them, something that was already waiting for them, or something the mountain itself grew to answer a prayer nobody should have prayed? One word. Post it before you hear the rest. Because once you know what those 3 men saw inside that cabin, you will never answer the same way again. To understand what happened to the Bellamy clan, you have to understand what the southern Appalachian mountains actually were in the years after the war. Not what the school books tell you. Not the postcard version with the log cabins and the smoke rising off the ridges and the fiddle music drifting down through the laurel. The real thing. Because the real thing is a great deal stranger and a great deal older than the school books are willing to sit with. By 1874, the Blue Ridge and the Smokies had been picked over by 3 separate armies during the war. The valleys were full of men who had come home to nothing. Farms had gone back to briar. Livestock had been driven off or eaten. The banks in Asheville and Morganton and Greenville had closed and reopened under new names. The paper money that had been good in 1861 was not good for kindling by the time a man walked back into his own dooryard in 1865. The government was far away. The law was a county sheriff and a handful of deputies who might ride out to a hollow twice in a year if the weather held. And above all of that, older than any of it, sat the mountains themselves. The people who lived up there had a different word for the mountains than the people who lived below. Down in the Piedmont, folks called them scenery. Up in the hollows, folks called them the old country, because that is what they were. The southern Appalachians are among the oldest exposed rock on the continent, older than the Rockies, older than the Alps, older than most of the bones under most of the world. And the people who lived in the folds of that rock understood, whether or not they could have told you why, that they were guests. The land had been there before them, the land would be there after them. And the land had its own way of dealing with anything it did not want. Now, into this country, in the late summer of 1874, came a man named Ephraim Bellamy. Ephraim was 39 years old. He was a lay preacher of no fixed denomination. He was a widower who had remarried and buried a second wife. And now he travelled with a third woman named Rebecca, who was 17 years his junior, and who was the mother of the 2 youngest children in his wagon. Ephraim had 6 children in all, ranging in age from a boy of 2 to a girl of 19, 9 souls in the wagon. All of them thin, all of them tired, all of them carrying the look that people had in those years. The look of a family that had already tried 3 places and been asked to move on from all of them. We know this because the general store in the town of Sharp's Mill kept a ledger, and the ledger has survived. On the 4th of September, 1874, Ephraim Bellamy purchased the following goods on account: 20 pounds of cornmeal, 10 pounds of dried beans, a can of coffee, a tin of matches, 3 woolen blankets, a hatchet, 2 pounds of nails, and a King James Bible with a broken spine. The storekeeper wrote a note in the margin: family of 9. Says he has bought the Miller place up the hollow. Warned him about it. He says the Lord provides. That is the first written trace of the Bellamy family in the historical record. That is also, in a manner of speaking, the last time anyone spoke to Ephraim Bellamy who did not later regret it. The Miller place. That is the piece we need to sit with for a moment, because the Miller place was not a place a man bought if he had any other option. It was a cabin, at the head of a hollow about 4 miles north of Sharp's Mill, up a track so poor that even in dry weather a wagon could only make it part way. The land had belonged to a family called Miller. Old man Miller had come into the hollow in the 1840s with a wife and 4 sons. By 1860 only 1 son was left, and by 1865 that son was dead of what the county coroner called a wasting complaint. The land had reverted to the county for unpaid tax, and the county had been trying, without success, to sell it for almost 10 years. Ephraim Bellamy bought it for $4 and a promise to pay the back tax within 12 months. Nobody warned Ephraim Bellamy about the well. Or rather, one man tried. The storekeeper at Sharp's Mill, according to a letter he wrote to his sister some years later, told Ephraim that the Miller boys had all died of a bad water, and that if he was going to live up in that hollow he ought to draw his water from the creek at the foot of the ridge and boil it hard. Ephraim listened. Ephraim nodded. Ephraim thanked him. And then Ephraim said, quote, "The Lord will make sweet what the Lord has made bitter," unquote. And he drove his wagon up the track and out of sight. That was the 4th of September, 1874. Nobody in Sharp's Mill saw any member of the Bellamy family again until the 2nd week of March, 1875, and by then only 2 of them were still moving. Before we move on to what happened when the wagon reached the top of that ridge, stop for a second. What you just heard about the Miller place and the wasting complaint that killed those 4 boys is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original county coroner's ledger, the tax entries, the storekeeper's letter. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. The wagon reached the head of the hollow late on the afternoon of the 4th of September. This we know because the oldest Bellamy daughter, whose name was Prudence, and who was 19 years old at the time, kept a small pocket diary. That diary was recovered from the cabin in March, and it is one of the 3 written accounts we still have. The others are the sheriff's report and the letter from the doctor. Prudence's diary is the only one of the 3 that begins on the day the family arrived and ends on the day the ink runs out. We will be returning to Prudence's diary all the way through this story, because in a certain sense, this whole story is Prudence's story. She was the only one in that wagon who kept a written record. She was the only one who noticed the pattern early enough to name it. And she was the one, when the end came, who tried to warn somebody. She was 19. She was thin. She was tired. And she was the last honest witness the Bellamy family would ever have. Her first entry is dated the 4th of September. It reads as follows. "We are come at last to the place Father says the Lord has given us. It is a poor place. The cabin is standing, but the roof wants patching in 3 corners, and the door has come off the leather. Father is glad. He says he can smell the water. There is a well in the yard, walled up in old grey stone that does not match any of the other stone hereabouts. Father says it is a blessing to have water so near. I looked into the well and I could not see the bottom, though it was still daylight and the shaft is not narrow. Little Ezra threw a pebble down and we did not hear it strike. Mother says the well is deep. Father says the deeper the sweeter. We are all of us very tired." That is the first entry. Read it again in your head and notice what is in there. Notice the pebble that did not strike. Notice the stone that did not match. Notice that Ephraim Bellamy, a man who by his own testimony smelled the water before he had drawn a single bucket, decided in that moment that the deeper the water, the sweeter. Prudence noticed all 3 of those things, and she wrote them down on the day it happened. She was 19 years old, and she was already seeing what the adults in her family were refusing to see. The cabin itself sat in a natural bowl of land. It was ringed on 3 sides by ridges of hard rock. It was blocked on the 4th side by a stand of old-growth hemlock that had somehow been missed by the loggers. The bowl was maybe 2 acres of workable ground. In front of the cabin, about 20 paces from the door, stood the well. It had been built up out of dressed stone to about waist height, and it had a wooden lid that was rotted through in the middle but still hung on iron hinges. The rope was gone. The bucket was gone. The windlass was gone. Whoever had lived in the cabin last had wanted to make it hard to draw water from that well, but they had not filled it in. That is one of the things that has bothered every historian who has ever looked at this case. Why cap the well with a rotten wooden lid and take away the bucket when a load of stones would have sealed the thing forever? The answer, as far as we can tell, is that the Miller family had tried to fill it in. They had thrown stones. They had thrown clay. They had thrown a dead ox down that shaft in the winter of 1852, and the well had swallowed all of it and come back the next morning as clear and as deep as it had been the day it was dug, as if nothing had been thrown at all, as if the shaft was simply not interested in being closed. Ephraim Bellamy did not know any of that either. What he knew was that he needed water for 9 people, and there was water 20 paces from his door. He cut a length of rope from the wagon harness on that first evening, tied it to a tin bucket, and drew up the first bucket of water the Bellamy family ever drank from the Miller well. Prudence's second diary entry, dated the 5th of September, describes the taste. "It is very sweet water," she writes, "sweeter than any well I have known. Father blessed it before we drank. The little ones drank a great deal. Ezra asked for a second cup. Mother says she has never tasted the like. It is as if the water has sugar in it, but not the sugar of the store. Some other sweetness. Father says it is the mineral of the mountain. I do not know. I drank 1 cup and no more. The taste sat oddly on my tongue." There is the second thing to notice about Prudence. She drank 1 cup and no more. Her father blessed the water and drank 3. Her stepmother drank 2. The 5 younger children, according to Prudence's careful accounting later in the same entry, drank between 2 and 4 cups each. Little Ezra, the 2-year-old, drank 4. Prudence, the 19-year-old, drank 1. That difference, that single cup versus 4 cups, is the reason we have a diary at all. It is the reason we have any account of what happened in the Miller cabin at all. Because Prudence Bellamy, from the very first drink, was the one member of the family who was not quite so much inside the well as the rest of them were. The rest of that first week, according to the diary, passed in the ordinary work of moving into a cabin that has not been lived in for 9 years. Ephraim patched the roof with cedar shakes. He split himself. Rebecca and the older girls swept out the mouse dirt and boiled the pot for a proper meal. The children played in the yard, and the youngest boy, Ezra, discovered that he could sit on the wall of the well for hours and stare down into it without getting bored. His mother told him twice to come away from the well. She did not tell him a third time. Prudence writes on the 9th of September that Ezra has taken to whispering into the well. She could not hear what he said. When she asked him, he told her it was a secret between him and the deep man. Prudence asked what deep man. Ezra said the man at the bottom. Prudence wrote, "I do not think Ezra has climbed down the well. Ezra is 2 years old. But he speaks of the deep man as if he has met him, as if the deep man knows his name, as if the deep man has been waiting." That is the 9th of September, 5 days after the first drink. 5 days. We have to stop the Bellamy story here for a moment and talk about the well. Because the well is not incidental to what happened in that cabin. The well is the whole story. Everything that came after, every death, every disappearance, every terrible line in Prudence's diary, and every worse line in the doctor's letter comes back to the well. If you understand the well, you understand what killed the Bellamy family. And to understand the well, we have to go back further than the Millers, further than the county, further than anything the storekeeper at Sharp's Mill would have known to warn Ephraim about. The well was not dug by the Millers. That is the first thing. When the county assessor walked the Miller property in 1853, he made a note in the survey. He wrote that the well appeared to be, quote, "of considerable age, and of workmanship not consistent with the region," unquote. That is a very careful sentence for a county assessor to write. It says 2 things without quite saying either of them out loud. It says the well was old, and it says the well did not look like the work of any of the settlers or their fathers. The stone of the well shaft, according to a report filed much later by a geologist from the University of North Carolina who examined the ruins in the 1920s, was a form of dressed limestone that does not outcrop anywhere in western North Carolina, not for 100 miles in any direction. Somebody had brought that stone up into that hollow from some distance we cannot now measure, and had cut and fitted it into a shaft that went straight down through the native granite for a depth that the geologist could not fully establish because his plumb line ran out at 260 feet without touching bottom. 260 feet. A hand-dug well in the 1800s was typically 20 to 50 feet deep. Some of the deeper artesian wells in the Piedmont went to 100. 260 feet, dug by hand through solid granite with dressed limestone brought in from we do not know where, in a hollow that had no wagon road until the 1830s. That is not a settler well. That is not a farmer well. That is something else. That is a shaft, and a shaft goes somewhere. The old people in Sharp's Mill, when they would talk about it at all, said the well had been there when the first white man came into the hollow in 1781. He was a long hunter named Cade, and he wrote in a journal that survives in fragments that he had found, quote, an old stone hole at the head of the North Hollow, walled about with a strange grey rock, and a smell coming up out of it as of pennies and river bottoms. Unquote. Pennies and river bottoms, copper and mud, metal and rot. That is what Cade smelled in 1781, 93 years before Ephraim Bellamy told his daughter that the deeper the water, the sweeter. The Cherokee, who had used the head of that hollow for something before the settlers came, had a name for the place. The name has been variously translated over the years, and the translations do not agree. The most common English rendering is the mouth that drinks upward. The mouth that drinks upward. Take a second with that. A well is a mouth in the ground. Water is what a mouth drinks. But the Cherokee name, as best the linguists have been able to reconstruct it, does not describe the well as a mouth that gives water. It describes the well as a mouth that drinks, and it drinks upward. It drinks the things that stand above it. It drinks the sky, or the light, or whatever it is that walks on two legs above the hole in the ground. There is a Cherokee story, recorded in 1887 by an ethnographer named Mooney, about a bad place in the mountains where the water came up sweet but the people who drank it grew, quote, thin at the edges, unquote, and eventually walked into the water and were seen no more. Mooney does not name the place. Mooney also does not have to, because when you overlay Mooney's rough map with the county survey of the Miller property, they are the same hollow. So, that is the well. That is what Ephraim Bellamy tied a harness rope to a tin bucket and drew a first drink from on the 5th of September, 1874. He drew that water from a shaft dug by nobody, the settlers remembered, out of a stone that came from nowhere the geologists could find, in a hollow the Cherokee had a name for that meant the mouth that drinks upward, and he blessed it, and he drank 3 cups, and he gave 4 cups to a 2-year-old boy. Now, the taste. Prudence writes about the taste on the 5th of September and again on the 8th and again on the 11th. The taste changes. That is the first thing that goes wrong that a person paying attention could have caught. On the 5th of September the water tastes of a strange sweetness like sugar of some other kind. On the 8th of September it tastes, in Prudence's phrase, like the smell of a bruised apple. On the 11th of September Prudence writes that the water tastes like copper and bread, metal and yeast. The water is changing as they drink it, or, more precisely, the water is answering. Because that is the thing about the Miller well that the geologists in the 1920s could not have known but the Cherokee had known for 200 years. The well was not a source of water. The well was a mouth, and a mouth does not have one flavour. A mouth has whatever flavour is put in front of it. When Ephraim Bellamy tasted mineral sweetness, the well tasted him tasting mineral sweetness and made itself more of that. When little Ezra sat on the wall and whispered his secrets to the deep man, the well listened, and the well shaped itself, drink by drink, day by day, toward the mouth that was drinking it. That is why Prudence, who drank 1 cup on the first day and never drank another, did not taste the copper and the bread. That is why Ephraim, who blessed the water and drank 3 cups and gave 4 to the baby, tasted whatever the well had learned he wanted to taste. The well was making itself into the family, and the family was drinking that back down, every cup, every day. Every blessing said over the bucket was one more thread pulled through. That is what a cursed well is, not a poisoned well. A poisoned well kills you and it is done. A cursed well remembers you. A cursed well studies you. A cursed well grows. The first change in the Bellamy family, according to Prudence's diary, happened on the 12th of September, 1874, 8 days after the first drink. It was not a dramatic change. It was a small one. It was the kind of change that a family, if it is looking for it, catches, and if it is not looking for it, does not. The change was this. Rebecca Bellamy, the stepmother, sat down to eat her supper on the evening of the 12th of September and did not eat any of it. She held her spoon. She looked at her plate. She smiled at her husband when he spoke to her. And when the meal was done and Prudence went to clear the dishes, Rebecca's plate was untouched. Cornbread, beans, a small piece of salt pork, all of it exactly as it had been set down. Prudence asked her stepmother if she was ill. Rebecca said no. Prudence asked her stepmother if she was hungry. Rebecca said yes. Prudence asked her stepmother, then, why she had not eaten. Rebecca said, quote, "I did not think of it," unquote. That is a strange thing for a mother of 2 young children to say in a household that is eating 1 hot meal a day and thanking God for it. I did not think of it. Prudence wrote the exchange down that same evening. She also wrote, underneath the exchange, 1 line of her own. Mother has drunk a great deal of water today. That was all, but it was enough. It was the first entry that named the pattern. The next morning, Rebecca did the same thing at breakfast. And at supper, Prudence began to keep account. The count is in the diary. Rebecca Bellamy, over the 6 days from the 12th of September to the 17th, ate approximately 1/2 of 1 normal meal. She drank, by Prudence's estimate, between 3 and 4 gallons of well water per day. She was not visibly wasting. Her colour was, if anything, high. Her eyes were bright. She sang while she worked, which she had not done in the wagon, but she was not eating. Ephraim was the second to change. Ephraim's change was different. Ephraim began, on the 15th of September, to preach. Now, Ephraim was already a lay preacher. And Ephraim had already been in the habit of speaking a blessing at every meal and reading a chapter of Scripture at every sundown. That was not the change. The change was that Ephraim began to preach at times and to nobody. Prudence records that on the 15th she came out of the cabin at mid-morning to draw water and found her father standing in the yard 12 paces from the well, delivering what she describes as a sermon of considerable length and heat, with no one present to hear it. He did not seem to notice that she had come out. He did not seem to notice, when she stood there for the better part of a quarter hour, that she was there. He was preaching. He was preaching toward the well. Prudence writes, and this is one of the lines from the diary that has stayed with every person who has ever read it, that her father's sermon that morning was not on any text she recognized. It was, quote, "in the cadence of Scripture, but not the words of Scripture," unquote. She could catch phrases, the names of angels she did not know, the names of rivers that were not in the Bible, a repeated line about the mouth that answers. That was one of the lines she caught clearly. The mouth that answers. And she remembered that Ephraim had never, in her hearing, in 19 years of being his daughter, used that phrase before. But he was using it that morning, at some length, in a sermon he was delivering to nobody, in the yard of a cabin that had been empty for 9 years, 12 paces from a well that the Cherokee had called the mouth that drinks upward. The little ones changed too. Ezra, the 2-year-old, we have already met. Ezra had been sitting on the well and whispering to the deep man since the 9th of September. By the 18th of September, according to Prudence, Ezra had stopped whispering and had begun to hum. The hum was low and continuous. He hummed while he sat on the well. He hummed while he ate. He hummed himself to sleep at night. Prudence tried twice to hum the tune back to him so that she could remember it. She could not. She writes, "The tune does not stay in the mind. It goes away from you the moment you try to hold it." But Ezra can hum it for hours and does not lose it. It is as if the tune is not in Ezra. It is as if Ezra is in the tune. The middle children, 4 of them, ranging from the girl of 7 to the boy of 13, went a different way. They became quiet. Prudence notes, on the 20th of September, that none of the middle 4 had spoken above a whisper in 3 days. They played, but they played silently. They ate, but they ate without asking for more. When Prudence spoke to them directly, they answered her. But they answered in single words, and they did not look at her when they answered. They looked past her. They looked, and Prudence is very specific about this, at a point in the middle distance about the height of a grown man, which was not occupied by anything Prudence could see. Now, Prudence herself. Prudence had drunk 1 cup of the water on the 5th of September and had not drunk another. She had, by her own account, been drawing her water in secret from a small spring she had found at the far end of the property, about a 1/4 mile from the cabin, behind the hemlocks. She had a tin cup she kept in the pocket of her apron. She would go for a walk in the mornings, and she would drink from the spring, and she would refill a small clay jug she kept hidden in the corner of the loft where she slept. That is why Prudence, alone of the family, was still Prudence. She was drinking a different water. She was eating the same food. But food, for whatever reason we are about to try to understand, was not the point. The point was the water. It had always been the water. On the 22nd of September, Prudence made her first attempt to warn somebody. She walked the 4 miles down to Sharp's Mill, alone, carrying a basket of dried apples her family did not need, and she stopped at the general store and she spoke to the storekeeper. The storekeeper, in the letter to his sister we have already mentioned, recorded the conversation as follows. She was a slight girl, thin as a reed, but her eyes were clear and steady, and she was not addled. She told me her stepmother had stopped eating. She told me her father was preaching to the yard. She told me her little brother was humming a tune that could not be held in the mind. She asked me if there was a doctor in the county who would come up to the hollow. I told her that Dr. Whitfield in Asheville was the nearest, and that Dr. Whitfield would want $1 for the visit and another $1 for the ride. She had no money. She thanked me. She left the apples. She walked home. The storekeeper adds, in his letter, that he considered the girl's story that evening and decided that a 19-year-old girl who had been shut up in a cabin with an eccentric preaching father and a new stepmother was probably suffering from a common form of homesickness. He did not send for Dr. Whitfield. He did not write to the sheriff. He did not go up the hollow himself. He put the dried apples on the shelf for sale and closed the store at sundown. He remembered the girl, he says, because she was polite. That is the word he uses. Polite. The last polite thing that would ever come down out of the Bellamy hollow. By the end of September, Prudence Bellamy was the only person in that cabin who was still, in any recognizable sense, a member of her own family. Everyone else was somewhere else. The bodies were in the cabin. The people were not. The diary through the first 2 weeks of October is thin. There are days when Prudence writes only 1 sentence. There are 2 days when she writes nothing at all. On the 6th of October she writes, "I am afraid to write things down because I am afraid Father will find the book." On the 8th she writes, "Father does not read any more. He listens." On the 10th she writes, "Ezra has grown. And that is all. Ezra has grown. A 2-year-old boy. Not a strange thing for a mother to say. A very strange thing for a 19-year-old sister to feel the need to write down in a diary she is hiding from her father. What did Prudence mean by Ezra has grown? On the 12th of October she is more specific. She writes, "Ezra is longer than he was. His arms hang past his knees when he stands. He does not walk right. He does not seem to notice. Mother does not seem to notice either. Only Sarah has noticed, and Sarah will not say. Sarah was the 7-year-old sister, the middle child, who had gone quiet. Sarah had noticed that her baby brother's arms hung past his knees, and Sarah had, in whatever way a silenced 7-year-old could, communicated this to Prudence. The children in that cabin were forming a small silent alliance against something they did not have the vocabulary to name. The physical changes are the part of this story that people have the hardest time with, and it is fair to say, right here, that we are relying on Prudence's diary and on the doctor's later notes, and that both of those sources are open to the criticism that they were written by people under extraordinary strain. Prudence was frightened and isolated. Dr. Whitfield, when he finally saw the interior of that cabin in March, was seeing it after nearly 6 months of whatever had already happened, and he was seeing it by lantern light in a place that smelled, in his own words, like a butchered animal that had been left in the sun. So take the physical descriptions as the honest testimony of 2 frightened and reliable witnesses who are describing what they saw and not what they wanted to see. Ezra's arms lengthened. That is the first physical change on the record. By the middle of October, according to Prudence, Ezra's arms hung to a point below his knees when he stood upright. His hands, she writes, had also become longer, and the fingers on both hands had begun to develop an extra joint, not a broken joint. Not a swollen joint, an extra joint. Prudence writes, I counted them. 4 times I counted them. There are 4 bendings in each finger and 3 in each thumb. This is not a thing that can be so. And yet it is so. Rebecca, the stepmother, was the next one to change physically. Rebecca had not eaten a full meal in nearly a month by the middle of October. She should have been wasting away. She was not. Prudence writes that Rebecca had, if anything, put on flesh. But the flesh was, quote, sitting oddly on the bones, unquote. Rebecca's face had begun to look, in Prudence's phrase, as if it were slightly ahead of itself, as if the flesh of her face was reaching forward, always by a small amount, ahead of where the skull underneath was actually placed. When Rebecca smiled, which she did often now, the smile arrived a moment before her mouth moved. That is what Prudence writes. The smile arrived a moment before her mouth moved. Read that twice, read it 3 times, and then ask yourself what kind of thing smiles before the face it lives in has moved. The middle 4 children, the silent ones, changed in a different way again. Their eyes changed. Prudence writes, on the 18th of October, that all 4 of the middle children now had eyes that were, quote, wet in a wrong way, unquote. They shone in the firelight. They did not blink as often as they had used to, and they were beginning, all 4 of them, to develop a habit of turning their heads in unison. Prudence would be at the hearth stirring a pot, and she would look up, and all 4 of the middle children would be looking at her from 4 different points in the cabin, and all 4 of their heads would have turned at exactly the same instant, not toward her, past her, at the same middle distance, the same height of a grown man. That was not there. Ephraim, the father, was the most changed and the least changed at the same time. Ephraim's body did not seem to alter. Ephraim looked, to Prudence's eye, exactly as he had looked on the day the wagon came up the track. Same beard, same clothes, same hands. What had changed about Ephraim was not visible. It was in the way he moved. Prudence writes, on the 21st of October, that her father no longer walked as a man walked. He was placed, she writes. He would be in one part of the room, and then he would be in another part of the room, and Prudence had never seen the crossing. He did not step, he was, in one place, and then he was, in another. He did not seem to notice this. He did not seem to notice anything. He preached in the yard, morning and evening, to the well. He blessed the water when it was drawn. He blessed each cup as it was poured. He drank his own portion, which by late October was 5 and 6 cups at a sitting, and he blessed each one. And Prudence writes, the well drank back. That is the phrase Prudence uses first, in the diary, on the 22nd of October. The well drank back. What she means by it, in the entry, is this. She was in the yard at dawn, drawing a bucket, and she saw the water in her own bucket ripple as she lifted it. There was no wind. The bucket was steady in her hand, and the water in the bucket rippled in a series of small concentric rings, exactly as if something at the surface of the water had, from below, taken a small drink. She lowered the bucket, she looked at the bucket, she looked at the well. She poured the water back into the well. She walked the 1/4 mile to her secret spring. She drew her own water. She walked back, and she did not draw from the well again for the rest of that day. That evening at supper, Ephraim asked her why she had not put out water. She told him the bucket had cracked. Ephraim looked at her for what she describes as a very long moment, and then he smiled, and he said, quote, the water finds its way to those who want it, unquote, and he did not press her further. Prudence writes at the bottom of that entry, in a hand that the archivists at the North Carolina State Archives have described as noticeably less steady than the earlier entries, one line, Father knows I do not drink from the well. Father does not care. The well does not need me. By the first week of November, people down in Sharp's Mill had begun to notice that they had not seen a Bellamy in over a month. This was not, at first, alarming. Families up in the high hollows often went weeks without coming down to town, especially as the weather turned. What was alarming was something else. It was not that the Bellamys had stopped coming down, it was that other things had started coming down instead. The first thing that came down out of the Bellamy Hollow, according to a young farmer named John Reese, whose farm lay at the bottom of the ridge, was a smell. Reese described it in a letter to his brother in Tennessee, written in late November. The letter is preserved because the brother kept it in a family Bible that was donated to a historical society in the 1950s. Rees wrote, and I will read it to you as he wrote it, that beginning around the 7th of November, there had come, on the north wind at night, a smell down off the ridge that he had never smelled before. He said it was not the smell of a dead animal. He said it was not the smell of a still or a smokehouse or a privy. He said the smell was, quote, sweet at first, and then behind the sweet there was a smell like the inside of a green branch when you break it, but the branch is old and the green is not right, unquote. His dog, he wrote, would not sleep in the barn on those nights. His cattle stayed at the far end of the pasture, and his wife, who was pregnant that autumn, would wake in the small hours weeping without knowing why, and she would ask him to please close the window even though it was already closed. The second thing that came down out of the hollow was the sound. Rees heard it first on the 14th of November. It was, he said, a humming. It was not the wind. It was not any bird or animal he knew. It was a long, continuous humming, coming from up the ridge, and it did not stop for the better part of an hour. He heard it again on the 17th and again on the 20th. By the 22nd, 3 other families in the valley had heard it too, and they had begun to compare notes. All of them agreed. It was a humming, it was low, it was continuous, it came from the direction of the Miller place, and none of them could hum it back afterward. The tune, they said, went out of the head the moment you tried to hold it. That is Ezra. That is Ezra Bellamy, 2 years old, sitting on the wall of the well, humming a tune that was not from any world Ezra should have known, and the tune was carrying 4 miles down the ridge on the night wind. A 2-year-old boy does not hum loudly enough to be heard 4 miles away. The Bellamys did not know that the well was carrying Ezra's voice. Nobody in the valley knew where the sound was really coming from. All they knew was that the sound was coming. The third thing that came down out of the hollow was Rebecca Bellamy. This is the part of the story that people forget when they tell it around fires and in taverns. They remember the well, and they remember the cabin, and they remember the sheriff burning it down in the spring. They forget that in the middle of November of 1874, Rebecca Bellamy came down the ridge to Sharp's Mill in broad daylight, walked into the general store, and asked for a pound of salt. The storekeeper served her. She paid in coin. She left, and the storekeeper closed his store at noon and did not open it again for 2 days. He wrote to his sister about it. He wrote that Rebecca Bellamy had come into his store on the 17th of November at approximately 11 in the morning. She had been alone. She had walked, he said, in a manner that was, quote, not the walk of a person who has walked 4 miles down a ridge road, unquote. She had not been out of breath. Her boots had been clean, which the storekeeper found remarkable given the state of the track. Her hair had been dressed. Her dress had been pressed. She had smiled at him. Her smile, he wrote, had arrived a moment before her mouth moved. And when she had asked him for a pound of salt, her voice, he wrote, had been the voice of a woman he had never met before. Not different in tone, different in kind. He could not put it more clearly than that. It was the voice of a woman he had never met before, coming out of the face of a woman he had known for 2 months. He gave her the salt. He took her coin. She left the store. He watched her from the window. She walked, he wrote, in a straight line up the middle of the road toward the ridge track. She did not turn her head. She did not stop to speak to anyone she passed. And the 2 people she passed on the road, both of them men well known to the storekeeper, both later told him that when Rebecca had walked past them, they had felt a cold on the side of their face that had been closest to her, not a wind, a cold like the cold that comes off a deep well shaft when you lean over it in the summer, a cold that had come with her, and that had left with her. The storekeeper closed his store at noon. He went home. He did not open the store again for 2 days, and when he did open it, on the 20th of November, he wrote a letter to the county sheriff. The letter has not survived, but the sheriff, whose name was Preston, referred to it later in his official report. The storekeeper wrote to Preston that there was a family up in the North Hollow that he believed was in serious trouble of a kind he could not put a name to. He asked Preston to ride up and see them. He offered to pay for Preston's time out of his own pocket. Sheriff Preston, according to his own report, received the storekeeper's letter on the 22nd of November. He did not act on it. He had, he wrote, 3 warrants outstanding in the eastern part of the county and a killing to investigate in Weaverville, and the North Hollow was a hard 4-hour ride each way in weather that was already turning. He would go up in the spring, he wrote, when the snow was off the track and the days were longer. The Bellamys would keep. That is one of the sentences in Sheriff Preston's report that Sheriff Preston would spend the rest of his life regretting. He set it down in his own hand in a ledger book that is still on file in the Buncombe County Archives. The Bellamys would keep. He signed under it. He turned the page. 2 weeks later, on the 5th of December, the sound coming down off the ridge changed. It stopped being a humming. It became something else. And by then, according to what Prudence would write in the last coherent entries of her diary, the second youngest Bellamy child was already dead. The child who died on the 2nd of December, 1874, was Ezra. He was 2 years old. He had been humming for 11 weeks. And when he stopped, according to the fragmentary and increasingly disturbed entries in Prudence's diary, the well answered, "We do not know what killed Ezra. Prudence does not say. The doctor, when he came in March, could not find the body. The body was in the well by then, or the body was in whatever the well had made of the body. But we can guess. A 2-year-old boy who has been drinking well water for 11 weeks, whose bones have already been reshaping themselves under his skin, whose voice has been carrying 4 miles down a mountain ridge in a tune no adult can hold in the mind. That child was not going to die of a fever. That child was going to be finished by whatever had already been finishing him since the 5th of September. Prudence writes, on the 2nd of December, 1 line, Ezra is gone into the water. That is all she writes for that day. On the 3rd of December she writes, Father did not weep. Father blessed the well. Mother did not weep either. The middle ones did not weep. Only Sarah wept, and Sarah was made to stop. On the 4th of December she writes, the humming has come back. It is not Ezra now, it is the well. The well has learned the tune. Read those 3 entries in sequence. A 2-year-old boy dies. His body is placed in the well by his father. The father blesses the well. The stepmother does not react. 4 of the middle children do not react. 1 child weeps and is silenced. And within 48 hours, the sound that had been coming out of Ezra for 11 weeks is coming out of the well itself, in Ezra's exact tune, at a volume that carries 4 miles down the ridge into the valley below. Think about what that means. Ezra had been the mouth. Ezra had been the voice. And when Ezra was gone, the well did not stop. The well continued. The well continued in Ezra's exact voice, because whatever was in the well had learned Ezra, had recorded Ezra, had drunk the tune of Ezra so completely that when the boy went into the water simply kept singing. The child had been erased. The song remained. That is what the well had been doing all along. It had not been drinking the family. It had been copying them. And now it was ready to play them back. That is what John Rees heard on the night of the 5th of December. That is why the sound that came off the ridge changed. It changed because the singer had changed. It was no longer a 2-year-old boy sitting on the wall of a well and humming to the deep man. It was the deep man himself, humming out of a mouth in the ground that was 260 feet deep, in a voice that had learned the shape of a human tune. Rees wrote in his letter that his wife went into labour that night, 6 weeks before her time, and delivered a stillborn girl at dawn. He does not draw a connection. He does not have to. Now, what was in the well? This is the question everyone eventually asks, and it is the question that the historical record can answer only in fragments, but there are enough fragments to build a picture. The geologist from the University of North Carolina who examined the site in the 1920s, whose name was Dr. Marcus Aldrich, did more than measure the depth of the shaft. He took samples of the water that had collected at the bottom, some 50 years after the cabin had been burned. The water, he wrote, was, quote, chemically inert in every test I applied to it. It contained no measurable dissolved solids. It contained no measurable minerals. It contained no organic material. It was, by every test known to modern chemistry, distilled water of a purity not otherwise found in nature. Unquote. Distilled water, perfectly pure. In a hand-dug well 260 feet deep, in a hollow full of decaying leaves and limestone runoff, in a shaft that had not been maintained in 50 years. That is not possible. That is the point. That is why Aldrich's report was quietly shelved by the geology department and was not published in his lifetime. because the water in that well should have contained a great many things, and instead it contained nothing at all. It was, in a chemical sense, not water. It was the absence of everything that water should contain. Aldrich made a second observation that has been even more difficult for later commentators to explain. He lowered a lantern down the shaft on a chain. He wrote that at approximately 180 feet the lantern went out, not because it ran out of oil, not because it was extinguished by a splash of water. It went out, he wrote, as if a hand had closed around the flame. He raised the lantern. It was intact. The oil was full. The wick was untouched. He lowered it again. At the same depth, it went out again. He repeated the experiment 4 times. 4 times the lantern went out at the same point. The 5th time, when he raised the lantern, the chain had been unhooked from the lantern's handle. The lantern was gone. The chain came up empty. He did not lower the chain again. He did not go back to the well. He packed up his instruments. He rode down the ridge before dark, and he never returned to the property. That is what the field notes say. He never returned. Aldrich wrote in his private notes, which were only recovered from his estate in the 1960s, that he believed the well was, quote, not a well in any sense the word intends. It is a structure that was built to look like a well by an intelligence that had studied wells at a distance and had approximated their form. I believe it is much older than the settlement of these mountains by any historical people. I believe it was built to touch something. I believe it is still touching that thing. And I believe that the thing on the other side is, in the manner of any predator that has been offered a hand, extremely patient. Unquote. Extremely patient. That is the phrase to hold. That is the phrase that has kept certain readers of Aldrich's notes awake for nights on end. Extremely patient, because a patient thing waits, and a thing that has waited 200 years for the Bellamys can wait 200 more for whoever comes next. The Cherokee story, which the ethnographer Mooney recorded in 1887, gives us the same picture from a completely different angle. Mooney's informant, an elderly woman he identifies only as the wife of Standing Wolf, told him that the mouth that drinks upward had been made by, quote, the ones who were here before the water came, unquote. The ones who were here before the water came. That is a phrase that Cherokee cosmology uses to refer to beings that predate the Great Flood in the Cherokee origin story. Beings, in other words, from a previous world. The wife of Standing Wolf told Mooney that the mouth had been made as a kind of feeding hole, that the ones who were here before the water came had put it there deliberately, in a place where the rock was thin between the worlds, and that they used it to draw up what they needed. What they needed, she said, was not water. What they needed was, in Mooney's rough translation, the singing that comes out of standing bones. The singing that comes out of standing bones. That is the sound of a human voice. Human beings are the only creatures on the mountain that sing while they are standing upright. So, put the pieces together. An ancient shaft, built of stone that does not come from these mountains, dug to a depth that no settler could have dug, filled with a water that is not water, going down to something that the Cherokee said was placed there before the flood, by intelligences that used the shaft to draw up the singing of standing bones. And into this shaft, on the 4th of September, 1874, a lay preacher named Ephraim Bellamy lowered a tin bucket on a length of harness rope and drew up the first of many drinks. The well was not poisoned. The well was hungry. And the Bellamys had walked into its mouth on their own 2 feet. The month of December is largely a blank in Prudence's diary. There are 7 entries in the entire month, and 4 of them are single lines. The last coherent entry is dated the 29th of December, 1874. It is worth reading in full, because it is the last time we hear Prudence Bellamy speak clearly, in her own voice, about her own family. She writes as follows. It is the 29th. I have not written for 11 days. I have not been able to. There has been no ink and no strength. Father has not preached now for 2 weeks. He does not need to. The well answers him without being asked. Mother sits by the hearth all day and does not move. Her skin is warm when I touch it, but there is nothing behind her eyes. The middle 4 are gone. I do not mean they have died. I mean they have gone. Their bodies are here. They sit at the table. They lie on the pallets at night. But there is no one behind their faces any more. Sarah went last, 3 days ago. I held her hand and I called her name, and she looked at me, and I could see that Sarah was no longer inside Sarah. Only the middle distance was looking out at me, only the height of a grown man, and Ezra is in the well, and the well is in all of them, and I do not know what I am. I have not drunk the water. I have not eaten with them for a week. I keep in the loft. I come down at night to draw from my spring. Father knows. Father does not care. The well does not need me. That is what I wrote before. It is still true, but now I understand what it means. The well does not need me because I am not the food. I am the witness. That is what has been kept. That is what I am for. To see this and to write it down. I will try to write it down. I will try to get down out of the hollow. If you find this book, may God forgive me for the things I have not been strong enough to prevent. That is the last entry Prudence made in the diary that anyone can read. There are 7 or 8 more pages of writing after that, but the writing is not in English. It is not in any language that any scholar who has examined the diary has been able to identify. It is written in a hand that resembles Prudence's hand, but is not quite hers. The letters lean the wrong way. Certain shapes recur. There is what appears to be a signature at the bottom of the last written page, but the signature is not Prudence Bellamy. The signature, insofar as it resembles any word in any known alphabet, most closely resembles the Cherokee glyph that Mooney recorded as the mouth. Just that, the mouth. Signed at the bottom of a page in a diary that had been kept by a 19-year-old girl who, by the 29th of December, was the only member of her family that anything resembling a human being still lived inside of. What was writing in Prudence's diary after the 29th of December? That is the question no researcher has been able to answer. It was not Prudence. Prudence's hand had certain distinctive traits, and those traits were not there in the pages that followed. But it was not Prudence either. It was, in some way, close enough to her hand that the archivists have argued about it for 100 years. Some have said it was Prudence in a state of what a modern doctor would call psychotic decompensation. Others have said the writing shows signs of having been produced by a person who was being physically compelled, whose hand was being guided. And a small number, working in fields that do not get their papers published in respectable journals, have argued that the writing is the well itself, that the well had, by that point, learned Prudence sufficiently to write in her hand, that the well was practicing. We do not know what happened in the cabin between the 29th of December, 1874, and the morning of the 9th of March, 1875. That is 10 weeks. 10 weeks of a Blue Ridge winter, in a cabin at the head of a hollow, with a well that had learned to answer without being asked, and a family that was no longer a family. What Dr. Whitfield and Sheriff Preston and the Methodist Circuit Rider found on the morning of the 9th of March is what we have to work from. And what they found is bad enough that all 3 of them, in the accounts they later wrote, apologized to the reader for what they were about to describe. All 3 of them, independently, in the same words. I ask the reader's forgiveness for the plainness with which I must set down what I saw. Here is what they saw. The cabin door was open. It had been open, from the look of the drifted snow inside the threshold, for some weeks. The fire in the hearth was cold, and had been cold for a long time. There was no food anywhere in the cabin. There were no bodies on the floor. There were no bodies in the loft. There were no bodies in the yard. The Bellamy family, all 9 of them, were not in the cabin, except that, in a certain sense, all 9 of them were. The 3 men, according to their converging accounts, stood in the doorway of the cabin for a long minute and did not go in. The smell inside was the smell John Reese had described from his farm 4 miles away, only concentrated now to a degree that Dr. Whitfield later called, in his letter, unbearable to a healthy man for more than a quarter hour, sweet at the front, old broken green wood at the back. And under both of those, a third smell that Whitfield could only describe as the smell of a room where a great deal of praying had happened and none of it had been answered. The interior of the cabin was clean. That is the second thing they all noted. It was not the clean of a house that has been kept. It was the clean of a house that has been emptied. There were no dishes. There were no clothes. There were no blankets. There was no chair. There was no table. There was no cook-pot in the hearth. The pallets in the loft had been stripped down to the boards. The floor had been swept. Not swept with a broom. Swept, as Sheriff Preston wrote in his report, as though something with a wide, flat surface had passed across it many times in overlapping strokes from the wall to the door. Everything that had been in that cabin had gone out through the door, or had been drawn out through the door, in one direction only, toward the well. Everything the family owned, every soft thing, every hard thing, all of it drawn in one direction over weeks or perhaps months, out the door of the cabin and across the yard and into the mouth of the well. The well, when they walked out to it, was capped, not by the old wooden lid, which was still lying to the side, rotted through and useless. It was capped by a great deal of matter that had been pressed down into the mouth of the well from above, filling the shaft to a depth of what Whitfield estimated as perhaps 6 feet. The matter was, in Whitfield's careful phrase, of organic origin. It was hair. It was cloth. It was leather. It was wood. It was, in places, bone. It was, in other places, things that Whitfield did not name. All of it had been pushed down into the well and pressed. Whatever pressed, it had been strong. Whitfield writes that at one point in his examination he set the point of his walking stick against the surface of the packed matter and pressed with his full weight, and the surface did not yield. It was, he wrote, like pressing against packed earth, except that it was not earth, it was the family. It was every possession of the family, and every soft part of the family, and it had been pushed down into the shaft as if the well itself had drawn them down and closed its mouth. The Methodist circuit rider, whose name was Elder Bascom, was the one who found Prudence. Prudence was not in the cabin, and she was not in the well. Prudence was in the hemlocks, at the far end of the property, next to the spring she had been drinking from all through the autumn. She was sitting with her back against a hemlock trunk. Her diary was in her lap. She was dead. She had been dead, Whitfield estimated, for perhaps 6 to 8 weeks. The cold had preserved her. Her hair had gone entirely white. Her eyes were open. Her right hand was resting on the last written page of the diary, on that final page that was signed with the mark of the mouth, in a hand that resembled hers but was not. Her left hand was closed around a small tin cup. The cup was empty. There was no wound on her body. There was no sign of struggle. She had, Whitfield concluded, simply sat down against the hemlock at some point in the middle of January and had not stood up again. Elder Bascom knelt in the snow beside her and prayed for the better part of an hour. When he was done, he took the diary out of her lap and put it in his coat. He took the tin cup out of her hand and threw it as hard as he could down the ridge into the laurel. He carried the girl's body, alone, the full 4 miles down the track to Sharp's Mill, because he would not permit the sheriff or the doctor to touch her. He wrote later, in a letter to his bishop, that he had believed, and continued to believe, that Prudence Bellamy was the only member of her family who had been saved. The others, he wrote, had been eaten. Prudence had been kept. And what Prudence had been kept for, he wrote, was to be found sitting against a hemlock in the March snow with a diary in her lap that told the truth about what had happened. She had been kept as the witness. And her only reward had been that when the well was finally full, and the family was finally consumed, whatever was in the well had permitted her to stop. She had been used. She had been spent. And she had been allowed, at the end, to sit down and be still. That was the mercy. That was the whole mercy. The 3 men rode back down to Sharp's Mill that afternoon. They stopped at the general store. The storekeeper opened a bottle he had been saving for a special occasion, and they drank it standing up. Nobody spoke for the first quarter hour. Then Sheriff Preston said, quote, "We are going to burn the cabin. We are going to cap the well. We are never going to speak of this again. And any man who asks us is going to be told the Bellamys took sick in the winter and were buried up on the ridge." Unquote. Whitfield nodded. Bascom nodded. The storekeeper nodded. And the following morning, at sunrise, all 4 of them, plus a wagon of iron plate, rode back up the ridge to the head of the North Hollow to do what Preston had said they would do. The burning of the cabin and the capping of the well, on the 10th of March, 1875, are described in Sheriff Preston's report in prose that is so dry it becomes, in its own way, one of the most frightening documents in the whole file. Preston records the event in 7 sentences. On the 10th of March we returned to the Bellamy property. We built a fire under the cabin using pitch pine and coal oil. The cabin burned entirely to the sill logs within 2 hours. We rolled a slab of iron plate, brought by wagon, over the mouth of the well. We drove 8 iron stakes through pre-drilled holes in the plate into the surrounding stone using sledges. We covered the plate with a cairn of fieldstone to a height of 4 feet. We salted the ground within a radius of 30 paces of the well and departed the property at sundown. 7 sentences. That is what Sheriff Preston set down in the official record. What he did not set down, and what only came out much later, in a private letter written by Elder Bascom to his bishop, is what happened during the burning of the cabin. The cabin, Bascom wrote, did not burn easily. The fire caught, and the fire climbed the logs, and the flames were the colour a fire should be. But the sound the cabin made as it burned, he wrote, was not the sound a cabin should make. It was the sound of a great many voices, at the very edge of what a human ear could catch, singing the humming tune that no one could hold in the mind. The tune came out of the logs as they burned. It came out of the roof shakes as they curled. It came, most strongly, out of the hearthstones as they cracked. And when the cabin finally collapsed, at about the 2nd hour, the sound stopped, all at once, like a hand had been laid across a mouth. That was the moment, Bascom wrote, that he became certain that the family had not been destroyed. The family had been swallowed, and what had swallowed them was, at the moment the cabin fell, deciding whether to swallow the 4 of them who were standing in the yard as well. They were spared, Bascom believed, for one reason. Prudence's diary. Bascom had the diary in his coat, and Bascom had, that morning before they set out, torn 1 page out of the diary. He does not say which page. He says only that he had torn out 1 page and had folded it and had put it inside his Bible, next to the 69th Psalm, and that he had done so on an instinct he could not explain. When the humming stopped and the cabin fell, he wrote, he felt the page shift in the pages of his Bible, as if it had been touched from the other side, and he understood, at that moment, that the thing in the well knew he had the diary, and knew that if it took him, the diary would be lost, and that the diary was, in some way that Bascom could not fully explain, but that he believed with the whole strength of his soul, the price of their leaving. They capped the well. They drove the stakes. They built the cairn. They salted the ground, and as the sun set behind the western ridge, all 4 of them mounted their horses and rode down the track without looking back. None of them, according to their own subsequent accounts, ever returned to the Bellamy Hollow again. Sheriff Preston sold his badge and moved to Georgia in the spring of 1877. Dr. Whitfield gave up general practice and took a post at a hospital in Baltimore, where he died in 1889 of what his colleagues described as a nervous condition of long standing. Elder Bascom continued his circuit until the end of his life. But he never preached in the North Hollow again, and he never accepted a call to any cabin that had a well in the yard. The storekeeper at Sharp's Mill sold his store in the summer of 1875 and moved to Charleston. He kept the letters he had written to his sister. He never spoke of what he had learned. He died in 1893, and the letters were found among his effects. And the well is still there. The iron plate is still there. The cairn is still there. The Miller property was never resold. It reverted to the county after the 12-month grace period expired. And the county has never, in 150 years, been able to find a buyer. In 1932, a WPA survey team walked the property to consider it for a state forest. They walked as far as the edge of the old hemlock stand. They did not go any further. Their report, 1 page long, contains a single recommendation. It reads, quote, "This parcel should not be developed, entered, or otherwise disturbed by the state of North Carolina, for reasons the undersigned prefers not to enumerate." Unquote. It is signed by the team leader. His signature is followed by 4 other signatures. There are no reasons in the report. There have been no reasons in any official document since Preston wrote his 7 sentences in March of 1875. The reasons are in a diary in a locked archive in Raleigh, and the reasons are in a letter to a bishop in a locked archive in Nashville, and the reasons are in the ground, under an iron plate, under a cairn of stones, at the head of a hollow that the Cherokee once called the mouth that drinks upward. The reasons are still there, and so is the well, and a capped well, a salted well, a well with an iron plate driven 8 times into the surrounding stone is still a well. It is still a mouth. It is still, in so far as anything as old as it can be said to want waiting. Prudence Bellamy was buried in the churchyard at Sharp's Mill on the 12th of March, 1875. Her grave is still there. The headstone reads only her name, her dates, and one line beneath: she was the witness. That is what Elder Bascom had cut into the stone. The bishop wrote back that the wording was strange. Bascom replied that the wording was the truth, and if the truth was strange, that was the fault of the world, and not the stone. The stone is small, the stone is granite, the stone leans a little to the east now, and in the summers the churchyard grass grows up around the base of it, and the local children walk past it on their way to school, and none of them know whose grave it is. Her diary is in the North Carolina State Archives in Raleigh. It is kept in a locked case in the rare manuscripts room. It may be read by qualified researchers with written permission and under supervision. The last written page, the page signed with the mark of the mouth, is not shown to researchers. It has been sealed inside a separate archival envelope, and the envelope has a note on the outside signed by 3 successive state archivists across the 20th century. The note requests that the page not be unsealed. It gives no reason. Elder Bascom died in 1891. In his will, he left his personal Bible to the Methodist Archives in Nashville. Between the pages of the Bible, at the 69th Psalm, the archivists found a folded page in a young woman's hand. They understood what it was. They filed it. It has never been transcribed. Bascom had carried that page for 16 years. He had carried it on horseback across 3 counties. He had carried it into the pulpits of 100 small churches. And he had never once, in any letter or sermon or private conversation, spoken of what was on it. He had simply carried it, as if the carrying was the whole of the duty. As if the page needed to be somewhere it could not be reached, and his Bible was the closest thing to that somewhere that he possessed. The Bellamy Hollow itself is now on the edge of a small tract of national forest. There is no trail into it. There is no sign. The Forest Service map marks the parcel with a small notation that says the area is closed to hiking, camping and hunting. Ask a ranger and you will be told it is a wildlife management decision. Press the ranger and you will be told the hunters used to go up there for the deer and stopped, on their own, without being asked, sometime in the middle of the last century. I want to leave you with the thing that Prudence Bellamy, at 19 years old, understood before anyone else in her family. The well was not a poison. The well was a mouth. It did not kill you by putting something into you. It killed you by teaching you to open. Every cup her father blessed was an invitation. Every cup he drank was a step across the threshold. And the moment the family stopped being able to notice that they had already crossed, the well began to draw them, one careful drink at a time, into itself. Prudence did not drink. Prudence watched. Prudence wrote it down. And Prudence, whatever else the mountain took from her that winter, kept enough of herself to sit down against a hemlock in the January snow, and to close her eyes with the diary in her lap and the truth safely under her hand. She was the witness. And the witness is what the mountain permits to remain, so that the story can be told. You have now heard it. What you do with it is between you and the very next well you drink from, between you and the water, between you and whatever the water has already learned about the shape of your hand, whatever it has learned about the sound of your voice, whatever it has learned about the taste of you drinking.